Hello, everyone. Welcome into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, October 21st around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start with that drubbing that happened in Austin, Texas this past weekend. Georgia went to work and planted their flag right back in the top of the SEC. So we'll break it down on today's show in the first segment. We'll also get into the officiating in that game. Not very good. I'll leave it at that for the time being. Then we'll get into a couple of different games in the top 10. Tennessee gets a huge win over Alabama at home. Second time in a row they've won that game in Knoxville. And then you had Miami win an absolute shootout against Louisville that was a little bit indicative of what Miami is this season. Then we'll get into a couple of statement teams, LSU, Indiana, Illinois, among a couple others that really made some noise this past weekend and kind of made a little bit of a statement moving forward. Then we'll get into the top 25. We have a ton of results going all the way back to Friday. Honestly, kind of forgot about that Oregon game just a little bit when I was preparing for the show, but we'll get into that along with all the other top 25 games, and then we'll just get into a little bit of a whip around. A ton of games that we haven't had a chance to get to throughout the first part of the show, we'll get into at the end, including that just drubbing South Carolina gave to Oklahoma this past weekend. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that tip and donation link, or to use that super chat, kind of went back to my old script there, but use the super chat at the bottom of the Sports Network chat. That little $sign, add a question, comment you'd like. Your name will pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be interactive as we head to the end of the season, and there's quite a few questions. No two ways about that, so definitely utilize that if you'd like to. And also, the GSMCpodcast.net page is still up and running if you'd like to use that. It does the exact same thing. So either one of those you'd like to use, definitely do. Make this a little bit more interactive, but we got to jump into this first one because Georgia went to work. There's no two ways about that. It was absolute domination pretty much from start to finish. Texas did a little bit to kind of come back in this game late in it, but at the end of the day, Georgia gets a win 30-15, really kind of plants their flag as they're not the Georgia team that a lot of us thought they were going into this game, including myself, to be totally honest with you, and they were all over the place. And I promise you, we will get to the craziness around the officiating here in a second, but I wanted to give some love to Georgia here before we got into all of that craziness. Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann just outright won this game. I don't think there's any two ways about it. They absolutely dominated Texas from start to finish. There were so many different examples of where Kirby just had the right play call, whether it was the Dalen Everett forced fumble where he came off the edge at the perfect time, or it was the incredible call on the fourth down stop that Texas could have definitely gotten back into it, but Quinn Ewers was under pressure pretty much from the jump, had to release the ball. Ryan Wingo catches it on a knee. So it's a huge difference in this game that Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann just did an incredible job just scheming up and getting all these guys into really bad situations, including Quinn Ewers and then Arch Manning when he did come into that game. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But overall, the quarterback stats are rather confusing in this one. Quinn Ewers had more yards. Beck had 3 interceptions. Ewers did have 3 turnovers, 2 fumbles, 1 pick, but at the end of the day, the Georgia defense won this game, and there's no two ways about that. In fact, during that entire game, Georgia had 6 scoring drives. They started on the Texas 13, 28, 30, 34, and then their own 45, the final drive was very long, much longer, or in the first half, I've kind of lost my train of thought here. UGA had 6 scoring drives in this game. Only one of them eclipsed more than 35 yards. In the first half alone, they got the ball on the Texas 13, 28, 30, 34, and then their own 45 was the worst field position they got in that half. Just absolutely, the Texas offense continuously hurt that defense, and frankly, the Texas defense played pretty good ball. It's very hard to be very angry at the Texas defense after that game because 30 points was a lot of it was just this Texas defense being put in terrible positions by this offense, and a lot of it was this pass rush was all over the place. Some of it was Quinn Ewers did a very bad job of helping out his offensive line at different moments. There was one sack in particular by Jalen Walker, I believe, near the goal line where he had a clean pocket to step up into, probably could have hit a big gain on that play. He didn't, and he missed that one. And a lot of this is something that probably shouldn't be happening to a third-year starter, and that's a big-time issue. It's one of the reasons he was taken out, and frankly, if you have a third-year starter that's getting rattled to the point where he's getting taken out of the game, you have some issues on your hands. No two ways about that. They're fixable issues. When you look back at this tape, I think Quinn Ewers is going to be able to say, yeah, I should have stepped up there, and I think his mental clock will be a little bit better when they go play Vanderbilt this upcoming weekend. But the reality is, he got absolutely terrorized and did not respond well. And Sark didn't necessarily respond well either, so they got a lot to figure out. And overall, we can talk about the offensive line. They got eaten for dinner. No two ways about that. But not nearly as much of this was on the offensive line as we probably thought. I mean, only 2 of the sacks were attributed to the blockers on this team. During this game, there were 7 sacks. So a couple of them were at least on the quarterback. A couple of them, like that Dalen Everett forced fumble, was just scheme-based. It was just Glenn Schumann and Kirby Smart going to work and absolutely dominating the day. And those 2 guys right there on the Georgia jerseys were a big part of that. And Jalen Walker, he made a lot of money on Saturday. I can promise you that. Jalen Walker had 8 tackles, 3 sacks, a fumble recovery. Michael Williams had 2 sacks and a forced fumble. And Dalen Everett played the best football I've ever seen him play in a Georgia jersey, a forced fumble and an INT. He was all over the place, was absolutely remarkable in this game. And overall, the entire defensive front just went to absolute work. But getting to a little bit of the issues with Texas and kind of here, let me go back here for a second. Getting to the issues in the quarterback position, because obviously Arch Manning did come into this game. Steve Sarkisian said after the game, Quinn Ewers is their starter, no doubt about it. He just needed to catch his breath a little bit, get a little bit his feet under him, and in the second half, played a lot better football. No two ways about that. Didn't play perfect by any means, but at the end of the day, played a lot more clean, played a lot more confident. If he played that way from the jump, I think Texas has a much better shot in this game. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of issues there. You have to be able to be, as a third-year starter, walk into a moment like this and not flinch. That's the biggest thing that Quinn Ewers has been able to do in the past part of his career. Shows up in these big-time games like Alabama, like Washington a year ago. Didn't play a perfect game, but definitely played some really good football there. And overall, he's been built for these moments in a number of different ways. It didn't show on Saturday by any means. So he's got a lot to figure out, no two ways about that. I tend to believe he's more than fine. I think that injury's bothering him just a little bit, but at the end of the day, you're good enough to be out there. You're good enough to play well. That's just the reality of the situation, and he's got a lot to figure out. If he, plays incredibly against Vanderbilt, all of this will be gone by the wayside, I can promise you that. But as of right now, I think he has quite a few questions to answer in this week's work, in this week's practice, and we'll see how he comes out against Vanderbilt. But as of right now, I don't think as a Texas fan you can feel super confident in what Quinn Ewers is giving you. I think he will be more than fine. I think you will feel confident going forward. On Saturday, he showed some issues that we hadn't seen in a couple of years, and that's definitely very worrisome. But moving forward to a couple of different things in this game, and the Georgia offense didn't necessarily play their best football. They did get the run game going, which was absolutely huge. If you see that Trevor Etienne the rest of the year, this is going to be a team that's going to be really hard to deal with. And obviously, the couple of picks from Carson Beck were an absolute problem. He's got to figure out what goes on in away games because he does get ahead of himself quite a bit. I think the first pick itself was just Andrew Makuba making a ridiculous play, but the other two were definitely an issue, and one we'll get into right now because that was the big talking point coming out of this game, and it probably should have been that Georgia was just absolutely incredible. The game plan and all of that stuff probably should have been at the forefront, but then some fans decided to throw some trash on the field. So the officiating, let's just start with this. It was absolutely offensive pass interference. I don't think people are necessarily disagreeing with that at this point. It's just the reality of the situation. Arian Smith definitely pushed off. They definitely got the call wrong initially, and they got it right after the fact. You cannot change it in that context. I don't even care if the guy comes into the huddle and says, I got it wrong, we have to be able to change it here. You can't. You just can't. The second that a bottle is thrown on that field, you have to make the conscious decision that you are not going to give in to that type of stuff. And you are not going to essentially reward that type of stuff because Texas has gotten their fine. Some fans are getting, their season tickets taken away, which they probably should. And congratulations, I hope it was worth it. But at the end of the day, you very much cannot give them that. You very much cannot encourage this behavior going forward, and that's exactly what the refs did. Now, I'm not here to tell you that the SEC called it in or anything like that because I think that's outright ridiculous. I just think these refs made the wrong call, period, end of story. I think they decided that they made the wrong call initially. I'm not necessarily saying they made the wrong call overall. I do think it was offensive pass interference. The reality is, the second that those fans start throwing bottles, you have to make the conscious decision that we can't give them this one. We have to just get this one wrong, take the lickings for getting the PI wrong, and then move forward with our day. That's just the reality of the situation. So that's a terrible, terrible thing that happened. No two ways about that. Texas has been punished, but the damage has been done in large part. There were a couple of targeting calls as well. More than anything, we just got to look at targeting as a whole. I don't think it's necessarily either of those calls were outright egregious. I also think neither of those calls were very aggressive and should have been, the targeting that we're trying to get out of the sport. But moving forward, I mean, obviously, we'll talk about this plenty over the next couple of days, and everyone will over the next couple of days. But how Georgia was able to win this game. The defensive game plan was absolutely incredible. 7 sacks, 10 tackles for loss, 28 total pressures. And I told you earlier, the blockers on those were only attributed 11 pressures and 2 sacks by PFF. So a lot of those were scheme-based. A lot of those were quarterback-based. So a lot of things to figure out if you're a Texas offense. But at the end of the day, the offensive line got eaten up. No two ways about that. The run game, I believe they averaged 1.1 yards per carry, and I think it was even less than that. I think ESPN did them a little bit of a favor by rounding up to 1.1 instead of 1. But at the end of the day, it was absolute domination. It started with Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann, and then they used the noise. You could tell it by Kirby Smart's post-game interview, although he went after ESPN and the refs just a little bit there. He used the energy, the noise that everyone was picking Texas, including myself, was picking Texas in this game, and they questioned the defense of this Georgia team. They questioned the ability outright of this Georgia team, and Kirby Smart just went out there and showed them. And this is the superpower of Kirby Smart that he got from Nick Saban. The ability to keep these guys intact. The ability to say, no one believes in you. You're the number 5 team in the country. There's plenty of teams of people that believe in you. But you have to get them to believe that. Because at the end of the day, they walk out there with their hair on fire, and you see what happens. It was absolute domination from start to finish. And then finally, responding. Regardless of how you feel about the officiating, whether you think it was the right call, wrong call, whether they should have given Texas the pick or not, I'm very much on the side of the second that they throw bottles on the field, you cannot give them that call. But at the end of the day, Georgia was able to respond pretty much every which way from Tuesday. There were a number of different calls. There were a number of different moments where Georgia could have said, man, nothing's going our way, could have kind of folded in just a little bit, but they kept moving. And especially that 89-yard drive, the only scoring drive that was over 35 yards for for Georgia in that game, came at the very biggest moment. And a couple of huge play calls by Mike Bobo where I think a lot of Georgia fans were expecting him to make not great play calls. He made a couple of incredible ones. They went down the field, scored a touchdown, and put this game away. So not enough can be said about this Georgia coaching staff getting these guys ready, and they came in and did what a championship team does. They tear a team to pieces that no one expects them to beat, and at the end of the day, they move forward as maybe one of the title favorites after a lot of questions around this team. But where they move forward from here, I think for Texas, a lot to figure out. No two ways about that. I think there's one of those things that you came out really, really flat, didn't necessarily have a good counterpunch to what Georgia was throwing at you, and at the end of the day, did not play good football. Period. End of story. All that being said, your defense played really, really well. Your defense gave you every single chance you possibly could have wanted to win this game. You have to fix up a couple of things on your offense. You have to be able to get Quinn Ewers more comfortable stepping up into the pocket and making those throws. And frankly, he's done that earlier in the year. We saw it in the Michigan game. That was probably the biggest thing I took away from that was his pocket mobility has taken a big time step forward. It didn't on Saturday, and it has to be able to show going forward, or they're going to get eaten up the exact same way with guys just going all-out pressure on him and Quinn Ewers getting a little bit flustered. But at the end of the day, all the goals are still ahead of them. You win out, you're definitely in the CFP. You're probably on your way to Atlanta for an SEC title and maybe a rematch with this team. So everything is still ahead of them. Obviously, in the 12-team playoff, it's much less about that one loss you take. It's much more about the way you bounce back. A big one against Vandy, which is now a ranked matchup, which we'll get into here in a minute. But at the end of the day, everything's still ahead of Texas, but quite a few things to figure out, especially at that quarterback and offensive line positions. And then for Georgia, if this is the team you get, if this is the D-line you get when you're healthy and attacking, call it. This is going to be a dominant defense. They are going to attack people from start to finish. If Dalen Everett starts to take his game to the next level, it's going to be a nightmare for just about anyone they play. Now, the big-time thing here is Carson Beck just has to play better on the road. There's no way they're going to be able to win a national title with Carson Beck if he cannot walk into opposing stadiums and get a big-time win. Period. End of story. They got a big one against Ole Miss going forward. I don't think Ole Miss is going to hand you all of the things that Texas did. I don't want to say hand you. Georgia earned pretty much everything they got on Saturday. say. I'm just saying in general, you're probably not going to get the number of mistakes that you got from Texas, from Ole Miss in that game. You got to be able to cause havoc, and frankly, this is a game that Georgia needed. They needed to prove to everyone that they are still the Georgia Bulldogs. They are still the team that you're going to have to deal with when you go through the SEC, and they're probably still the class of the SEC. They're not at the top right now. Obviously, that's A&M and LSU, and we'll talk about that game later in the week, but at the end of the day, this is one of those teams that whenever you count them out, you probably shouldn't have. Frankly, I made that pick with Texas on Thursday. I picked them to win. Then I saw a lot of people start picking Texas, and you started to get closer to game time, and you thought, Georgia's probably going to win this game, but they won it in dominating fashion. Incredible win from them, and they move forward with everything intact and probably the second or third betting favorite to win the national title right about now. I didn't check it, but have to assume they're very much towards the top. But let's take our first break. Went a little bit long there. Let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about Tennessee and Miami. Tennessee wins a rock fight. Miami wins a shootout, but they both find themselves in a very, very good place for the CFP. So we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. Some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about that drubbing that Georgia gave to Texas, kind of proved themselves as still the class of the SEC, and it's happened to Georgia before with Alabama. It just happened to Texas. They got a little bit humbled, a little bit of a welcome to the SEC moment, but it's how you bounce back in this year. No two ways about that. We'll find out on Saturday what Texas can do against Vanderbilt, but let's get into a couple of these games because Tennessee got a huge win this past weekend, and it was a weird game. It was one of the uglier games, to be totally fair, in that first half because these teams were all over the place. They could not hit an open receiver to save their lives. Frankly, Tennessee probably could have been up by 21, 28 points at halftime if Nico could have hit an open receiver, but he couldn't. And then he hit one huge one down the stretch, and it was one of those moments where you kind of felt a lot shift. I don't know if I'm making too much of this moment, and I've seen some Tennessee fans say this, but obviously fans get a little bit more excited than maybe you should. But at the end of the day, I do think that was a moment that could have changed Tennessee's season. Seeing that ball thrown all the way downfield, Dante Thornton makes a great play on it. They get all the way in scoring position, take the lead in that game. I don't know. It was one of those moments where you felt like a lot of things flipped for Tennessee, where a lot of things kind of fell into place and things really, really started to get going. And that was kind of the story of the game because the reality is this Tennessee team is an absolute problem defensively, and they only have to make a couple of plays offensively. When they have a defense and a D-line and a back end that I did not expect to play as well as they did, Jamal McCoy was incredible all over the place. He did have one play that maybe should have been defensive pass interference, but at the end of the day, played a really, really good job, did a great job covering Ryan Williams, and had a huge INT in the end zone, obviously. But then, on the other side, two very different halves from Nico Iamaleava and Jalen Milroe in the second half. Nico came out there and responded from the first half that he had, missed a lot of big-time throws, came back out there, made all the types of plays you need him to make, made a number of plays with his legs, which is going to be a huge thing for Tennessee going forward, and then Milroe just kept making mistakes, and there are some questions about his health. I definitely have them as well. It did not look like the normal Jalen Milroe, did not get to run the ball nearly as much as he wanted to, and frankly, I don't think that was necessarily something that Tennessee was just entirely going to be able to take away. So I do think there is some extenuating circumstances there, and probably has to do with Jalen Milroe's health. Something to watch going forward. They got Missouri at home this upcoming weekend, but a massive win for Tennessee. There's no two ways about it. I mean, when you get that type of win and when you get to pull down the goalpost the way they did, and people making fun of them for that, grow up. It's kids having fun. Calm down. Like, it's not that big of a deal. But at the end of the day, Bama gets absolutely eaten up by the state of Tennessee this year, and there's big-time questions in Tuscaloosa. I am not near questioning what Kalen DeBoer can do at this job, because at the end of the day, this is not quite his team yet. But they got some issues. No two ways about that. But how Tennessee was able to win this game, the halftime reset was huge. There were so many things that went wrong in the first half. Frankly, or actually, they scored 0 points in the first half for the third consecutive game. And in the second half, a couple of those games didn't necessarily respond all that well. The Florida game really had to pull teeth to get the scores that they needed to down the stretch to win that game in overtime. And then in the Arkansas game, obviously, didn't bounce back from that, ended up losing that one. In this one, they were able to. They opened the second half with touchdowns on 3 of the first 5 drives and never really looked back. It was really, really incredible, and it was one of those things that I think Nico needed. I think he needed to prove to himself that he can have a slow start and then bounce back, and now all the confidence in the world going forward, I would have to assume. And then no room for Jalen Milroe. We talked about him possibly being injured. I would be very surprised if he wasn't, because 14 carries for 11 yards is not something that he does very often. Now, the Tennessee D-line did a great job of pinning him in, no two ways about that, but at the end of the day, Jalen Milroe is too elite of an athlete to not get loose a couple of times. There's something else there. I feel pretty good about that. And then finishing. Bama's final 4 drives totaled 3 yards, so that's exactly what you want to do. If you're Tennessee's defense, it was a punt, turnover on downs, and then the game-sealing INT by Will Brooks. Just an incredible game by this defense overall, and I can't say enough about what they're doing over there. It's just absolutely incredible to watch this team fly around. To me, they have the best defensive line in the country, and it's not all that close. They're all over the place. They're really, really incredible, and they're one of those teams that, although the offense is not quite what they envisioned this year, the defense might just carry you to a national title, and Dylan Sampson as well, because he was incredible in this one, as he often is. But where they go from here, I think Alabama is a little bit tough to figure out, because the reality is I think a lot of the issues go beyond the field, if I'm being totally honest. Now, there are plenty of issues on the field. I'm not arguing that, but I think this team has mental toughness issues. I think they have issues with these players just not playing full energy the entirety of the game, and I think that's pretty clear when you're watching it. I mean, we had guys literally hitting step back jumpers while your team was getting stuffed on 4th down. That can't happen. Why are those players on the field if that's what they're going to do on that play? So there's a lot of stuff to figure out. I'm not remotely near worrying about Kalen DeBoer at this job. I still think he is very much the right man for it. I still think he's going to have a ton of success coming forward. They got to change a lot of the things about the way they go about business around there, and I think they definitely will, if I had to be honest. And Tennessee, this is huge for Nico's confidence. He absolutely needed a game like this where everything was really ugly. He was doing the things that we worried about in the first half of the game. And then in the second half, he looks a little bit more like himself. Still miss some throws, still, has some things to get better at. But when you make that big-time throw at the end of the game to win that one, that's about all you need. It's so much confidence. It's so much to build off of. And then obviously going to UGA could be a program-defining win. If you get that win, you are on your way to the SEC title. You're on the way to the CFP. And frankly, you might be the number 1 team in the country going in. So a lot still on the table. Is one of those turning point moments for Tennessee and Alabama really for the season. Tennessee now looks at the CFP and the SEC title with really, really real aspirations. And Alabama is left looking around trying to figure out what happened, pretty much. Moving over to Miami-Louisville, because this one was very different. It was not necessarily the rock fight that we just talked about. It was an absolute shootout. In the third quarter, one of the wilder quarters that I have ever seen in college football. I can't remember who was calling the game, but they wanted to give it an Emmy. I'm all for that. It was absolutely incredible. The drive charts in the third quarter were Miami touchdown, Louisville kickoff touchdown on the very next kick, Miami fumble, Louisville touchdown, Miami touchdown, Louisville touchdown. It was absolutely incredible. Explosive play after explosive play, and this Miami team just found a way to win. That was the important part of this game, just finding a way to win, doing just enough, and it was Cam Ward again. That's just what this team is. It's Cam Ward makes all the plays in the world, and this defense does barely enough. And that's the reality of this season for Miami going forward, and we'll see if they can develop into a little bit better defensively. But as of right now, it seems to be a little bit of that LSU last year type formula, where you have a guy that's going to make all the plays in the world, and you have a defense that's going to give up a lot of big plays. The good news for them is they don't play in the SEC, so there could be a few losses on that schedule for sure. But Cam Ward doing ridiculous things. The touchdown to Colby George that you're seeing right there, ridiculous throw. I don't know many people in the country that would make that throw to begin with, but then could actually make it get where it wanted to go. Ridiculous. And this Miami team overall, they're doing exactly what you need to do right now. They're staying alive. It's not necessarily about anything other than that, because at the end of the day, you stay alive, you book a trip to Charlotte, you play Clemson, you win that game, you're well on your way to a playoff, and you're feeling very, very good about what you're doing. So at the end of the day, wasn't all that pretty. The defense has to figure out a number of different things. The D-line is one of those things that if they can pick it up, they can totally just win games by themselves. So there's a lot of potential there. No two ways about that. But if the D-line doesn't get there, we can see what this back end is about. So you're going to have to be able to kind of correct some things, not necessarily, outright changes, not necessarily go crazy, but at the end of the day, you very much have to be better defensively, or at some point, someone's got to get you. At least I have to assume. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Cam Ward has enough magic, but when you talk about the keys to this game, quick responses was huge for Miami. It was absolutely incredible to watch this team. They did everything they needed to do. Whenever Louisville threatened, whenever Louisville got within 7 points or even got tied at one point in the second half, Miami responded very, very quickly. They came right back down the field. Louisville tied the game in the third quarter. Miami back down the field in 6 plays, takes the lead back, and never really gave it back. It was absolutely incredible to watch this team, and obviously Cam Ward magic is a part of this. Frankly, it's a part of every single win that they have going forward, but 21 for 32, 319, 4 touchdowns, and the biggest thing, no interceptions. If he has no interceptions going forward in the majority of their games, they're going to be a really tough team to beat, because they're going to score maybe 52 points in just about every game going forward. And then the final one is controlling the clock. It was a very, very weird game with so many explosives, so many big plays down the field. Miami having 10 more minutes of time of possession and running the ball 37 times compared to Louisville's 21 was probably the difference in this game. Being able to elongate those drives just a little bit, just make those 1 or 2 extra plays that make the Louisville defense stay out there just a little bit longer, I think was the difference in this one. And it's one of those things that Miami, if they get that run game going, I don't know who's stopping them, if I'm being totally honest with you. So really, really good stuff from this team, and one of those teams that it's a narrow path to victory for most of these games, but at the end of the day, when you have a guy like Cam Ward, becomes a little less narrow in a hurry. So remarkable stuff from this team, and they just keep answering the bell. Every time there's a little bit of a worry in this team, they continue to respond and just make all the plays that they need to make. But where these teams go from here, I think for Louisville, they're still a dangerous team. They're very flawed. They are who they are, kind of like Miami, just not nearly as talented all over the field, where Louisville's going to make their big plays. They're going to struggle to stop big plays, and that's just kind of the way they're going to go about business. Now, this does make them a dangerous team. It does make them a team that can beat pretty much anyone on their schedule. It also makes them a team that could lose to just about anyone on their schedule if Tyler Shuck is just a little bit off that day. But the defense just missed the mark this year. That's probably the biggest takeaway if you're a Louisville fan, where you felt like you had some dudes. You felt like Ashton Gelati, a lot of guys that really are really talented players, just haven't shown up. There have been a lot of misses this season, and they could easily finish this season 8-4, but I don't think that's what they expected this year by any means. So definitely a little bit of a miss mark, but overall, a team that feels like they're moving in the right direction. Jeff Brom, whenever he has an offense, is going to be very successful. I think they're going to have to recruit the high school ranks a little bit more aggressively going forward, but overall, really good stuff from Louisville as a program, and I think they're going to move forward more than fine, but this year, probably not their year. And then for Miami, it's been ugly, no two ways about that. The last couple of weeks, it's been a fight, but you get the wins, and that's the important part. Cam Ward in this offense is going to be an absolute problem for any defense they face, and the defense, the good news for them is they don't have to be near perfect. They just got to make a couple of plays a game, get that 1 or 2 picks a game, and then you're probably going to be able to win 90% of the games that you play in. Obviously, they feel like a team as of right this second that they're going to play really good football throughout the regular season, maybe go undefeated, but when they have to play a Clemson, when they have to play a playoff game, they're probably going to struggle. Now, a lot of things can change. If that defense comes along a little bit more, then obviously my tune will change quite a bit on that. But right now, they look like a team that is executing the way that they need to. They're winning the games that they need to, but at the end of the day, at a certain point, you got to line up in front of Clemson. At a certain point, you got to line up in front of maybe Texas or UGA or Alabama, probably not Alabama, or Tennessee, and I don't know if they're going to be able to respond. That will be an interesting thing to watch. Maybe they're a team that rounds into form towards the end of the season, and that defense is a good thing going forward into the CFP, but as of right now, they're a team that just keeps teetering, and at some point, I just have to assume they're going to fall over. But we'll see what happens with that. We'll take our second break here, and when we come back, we got to get into a couple of teams that just made some real statements. LSU might have been the biggest one to me, but Indiana not nearly far behind them. So we'll talk about that right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Tennessee's big win over Alabama, as well as Miami winning an absolute shootout, and Louisville, Kentucky, a huge win for them, and keeps both those teams in the CFP and in their conference hut, which will be very interesting to watch going forward. And we'll start with that conference that Tennessee's in, and it's getting a little bit more cleared out, but also a little bit murkier. It's very hard to get a beat on the SEC right about now. But LSU's making statements. I can tell you that with absolute confidence. This is a team that it would have been very easy to lose this game. This is one of those moments, right? You have an emotional, crazy overtime win over Ole Miss in a game where they were circling it from January. I can absolutely promise you that. They very badly knew that they needed to win that game if they wanted any shot at the CFP. And then you go up the road and you play a really good team up there in Fayetteville that had beaten Tennessee earlier in the year, had caused problems for just about anyone, has a player in Taylon Green that can cause all types of issues defensively, and they handled business like it was nothing. It was absolutely incredible to watch this team, and not enough can be said about what Blake Baker and this entire defensive staff has done for this team, because the reality is it's just absolute domination. They're all over the place. They're playing really, really strong football, playing exactly where they need to play, which is 90% of the battle, just being where you need to be. Everyone is playing their job, and Zaya Alexander's playing incredible coverage on the back end. There was a hit from Sage Ryan that made me feel like we got LSU back just a little bit in this game, although it was flagged for some crazy reason. At the end of the day, this is an LSU team that's going to fly around. They're going to play better defense, and it's kind of weird saying that. Even a couple weeks removed from that USC game, it's weird to say that. But a couple of keys to victory here. Whit Weeks is an absolute star. He's becoming one of my favorite players in all of college football, and it's not just because of the cornrows, but at the end of the day, a very, very talented player. 9 tackles, 1 tackle for loss, 1 sack, and an INT that was was followed by the best celebration I've ever seen in my entire life. But the dude is awesome. He's all over the place. He's everything that this team needs to be, especially in the middle of that defense. You need a guy that plays a little bit like a psychopath, and this is exactly what he does. I absolutely love Whit Weeks, and he's one of those guys that is really kind of the personification of what Blake Baker wants to do on defense, just outright aggression from start to finish. And then overall, the defensive confidence is totally different. There's no players out there that look like they're guessing anymore. There's no players that feel like they're out of their shoes or they feel like they're chasing or anything like that. Everyone's where they need to be. They're doing their job and they're executing at a ridiculously high level. And then Garrett Nussmeier. Garrett Nussmeier was not spectacular in this game. 23 for 34, 233, and no touchdowns, no interceptions. The kid just plays really good football. Frankly, you look around the SEC, Diego Pavia, I don't want to give any disrespect to him, but there are very few quarterbacks playing as good of football as Garrett Nussmeier is right now. He's making every single play, and frankly, as I look around the country and I'm trying to figure out who my favorite for the number 1 quarterback off the board in the draft is, This guy's climbing the boards very, very quickly, at least in my mind. I'm not sure what the NFL scouts are thinking right about now. But huge win for LSU. They keep rolling on. They're one of those teams that they feel like they're finding something. I said it last week. I redid my picks, and I have LSU in my SEC title game. I did have Texas as well, so went kind of two opposite directions. But at the end of the day, this LSU team is finding something, and I think they're going to be a problem going forward. This was a drubbing. This was an absolute domination from pretty much start to finish. This Indiana team is absolutely for real. Curt Cignetti has done remarkable things, and it's not just, the personnel changes, because that's a huge part of it. Obviously, Curtis Rourke has played great football. Elijah Surratt is an absolute problem on the outside. They have two running backs that are just incredible from start to finish in this game. But the energy around this team is different. They walked into this game knowing that they were the better team, knowing that if they went about their business the way that they always have, they were going to win. And frankly, Curtis Rourke even went down with an injury, and Taven Jackson came in and totally dominated. It looks like he's going to get the start against Washington, so definitely something that you badly needed to see. And more than anything, I think the biggest thing here was you got Nebraska reaching early, and Nebraska is not a team that can play from behind very often because they want to run the ball. If they can't run the ball, they're not going to be able to be successful. I know for a fact that when they were writing up the game plan for a win here, Dylan Raiola throwing 44 passes was not on it. I can absolutely promise you that. They just had no running room, and that was the reality of the situation. And that goes to the next thing. Line of scrimmage domination was absolutely for real. Nebraska ran for 70 yards on 29 carries. Pressure on Raiola was pretty consistent throughout the game, and then 280 yards rushing and only one sack allowed on the other side. So that's where you win Big Ten games, and man, did Indiana win that battle on Saturday. And then not missing a beat. This is a huge thing for this team going forward. Obviously, this is going to be the guy that makes the start against Washington this upcoming weekend. So Curtis Rourke leaves this game right nearing halftime, but really halftime is when the change was made, and Taven Jackson comes in 7 for 8, 91 yards, 2 touchdowns, just executed the offense and did a really, really good job doing it, and frankly, badly needed the confidence booster heading into a game where you're going to play a really solid Washington defense, although they got exposed by Iowa a couple of weeks ago. This is still a very solid unit, and he badly needed that one to just get his mind right, feel confident going into the next one. So huge win for Indiana. They keep rolling forward, and they're one of those teams that they keep piling wins, and at some point they're going to meet up with Ohio State, and you turn it on for one weekend, this entire sport turns on its head very, very quickly. But we'll get there when we get there. No two ways about that. Another team that I was really impressed by was Kansas State. This was a game that, kind of like a couple of the other ones we just talked about, they could have fallen into this trap pretty comfortably. Kansas State was coming off a couple of big-time wins. West Virginia coming off a loss to Iowa State that they badly wanted. It felt like a game that could have been a little bit sketchy. Kansas State handled business. And the first half was a lot different than the second half. So props to West Virginia for sticking around. But when Kansas State needed to, they absolutely turned it on. And another team, kind of like LSU in the SEC, I think Kansas State's finding themselves, both offensively and defensively. And I think they're one of those teams that I don't know if anyone in the Big 12 wants to see right about now. But how Kansas State was able to get this win, Avery Johnson is starting to kind of sling the rock around, which is not necessarily the way that I thought Kansas State was going to be able to win games. That's exactly how they won this one. He went 19 for 29, 298, 3 touchdowns in this game, and I believe no INTs if I'm not mistaken. Remarkable stuff from a guy that 2 weeks ago you wouldn't have trusted to throw a pass over 10 yards. Just the reality of where he was at, but he's been able to bounce back in a huge way, and this team really, really is in a great spot going forward if that's the performance they're getting every week. And then a strong third quarter can change everything. Everyone knows coming out of that halftime, whoever responds the best is usually going to be the team that wins. Well, Kansas State was held only only had a 7-point lead at halftime, and then in the third they scored 21 very, very quickly, and then scored right again in the fourth quarter to take the lead to 28. So they pretty much buried them very quickly in the second half, and then the Mountaineers had no running room, which is another thing we've talked about with West Virginia over the last couple of weeks. They pretty much have to get over 200, 250 yards if they're going to win a game, because passing the ball, they're not going to be effective. That's just the reality. They had 3.5 yards per carry, only 152 yards on the ground. Was never going to be enough against this Kansas State team, and frankly, isn't going to be enough the rest of the season. So if you want to find out what West Virginia did on a weekend, just look at how many rushing yards they had. If it's under 150 or right around there, they probably lost. If it's over 200, then maybe they won that game. But overall, really, really good stuff from Kansas State. I think it's one of those teams that just continues to find their stride. Obviously, BYU, Iowa State to go through, and they have Iowa State at the end of the season, which will be very interesting to watch. But a really, really good team that feels like they're starting to come into what we expected them to be at the beginning of the season. And then finally, a gross game. No two ways about that. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I don't know if people agree with me or not. I love these Illinois jerseys. I thought they were so cool from start to finish. The helmets are as cool as I've ever seen them. I know people don't love the jerseys. I'm into them. I don't know what it is. I absolutely love them. Maybe it was just because they got the win, to be totally honest with you. But a massive win on a massive day for Illinois. The Red Grange Unis home fan base was going absolutely crazy, and you got a huge win. No two ways about that. This was one of those games that a lot of people, including myself, frankly, pegged as a Michigan win because I really felt like Jack Tuttle was going to make a difference in this offense, and he did not. It was not very pretty for them passing the ball by any means. He did have a pick in this game. I don't think he might have gotten over 100 yards passing, but it wasn't pretty getting there. But at the end of the day, really, really good stuff. I think for Michigan, you are who you are at this point. At the offseason, find a new quarterback, find a number of different offensive linemen, and see where you stand. But as of right now, it's going to get rough. I don't even know if they make a bowl game going this way, but we'll figure that out when we do. But a couple of keys to this game. I think the biggest thing is when you force Michigan to throw, you win the game. Plain, period, end of story. Michigan was only able to average 3 yards per carry in this game. Throwing the ball 32 times is not necessarily the path to victory for Michigan to win, but no runs over 20 yards as well. Not going to win you the game. That's just the reality of Michigan, and Illinois did it to an absolute T. And then the defensive line for Illinois just dominated. This Michigan O-line is not nearly the Michigan O-line that we saw last year, and it really showed in this game. Gabe Jacas had 13 tackles, 2.5 sacks. He was all over the place. It was absolutely remarkable, and it was one of those games where when you see that defensive line go to work pretty much all day, you know exactly the way this game is going, regardless of what Illinois did on offense. And frankly, it wasn't a ton. This wasn't going all that great, and adaptation was the other part of this because this offense did not play very well. 80 passing yards did not necessarily seem like the plan going into this one, but they got it done. They did what they needed to do, did not play a pretty game offensively. When your defense holds a team to 7 points, you're going to win most of those games. So really good stuff from Illinois. I feel like they're starting to show people that they're playing just really good football. You know, I don't think they're necessarily going to factor too much into the Big Ten race. I don't necessarily think they're going to be a team that's going to be an outright problem going forward. I do think they're a team that any team on any given day is going to have an issue with. And it's going to be really awesome to watch this team going forward. But another one of those teams that really just continues to play really good football, and frankly probably should be higher ranked in the AP poll right now, but that's an issue we can get into on another day. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we got to get into the top 25 results. There were a number of games, whether it was Iowa State coming back and preserving their undefeated season, Notre Dame kind of going down to Atlanta and getting a pretty good win, a win that was a little bit complicated, and I'll get into that right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the statement teams from this past weekend. LSU and Indiana made the biggest statements, at least in my mind. Really proved that they are big-time contenders in their conference, and maybe, just maybe, get into that CFP for Indiana. It would be incredible to watch that unfold. But let's get into a couple of top 25 results, and the first one here, I'll be totally honest with you guys. I forgot this game happened. There was so much stuff that happened on Saturday that when I was preparing for this show, didn't include this game until I realized it was a game that I needed to cover. And I realized now it says 6 next to Oregon. It should say 2. But at the end of the day, domination. Really, really good stuff from Oregon in the game that I know a lot of people, including myself, were circling just a little bit. Trying to watch them go on a Friday night on a short week to West Lafayette was just one of those Big Ten moments, and it would have been very, very weird if they were to lose this game. But at the end of the day, the response is just who Oregon is. It really does show what this program is going forward. It shows what Dan Lanning's been able to do. It shows how tight-knit this group is, and how the leadership is really coming along, which was one of my worries coming into the season. When you have so many different portal guys coming in, leadership can be an issue. It's not an issue on this team. I can say that very, very confidently, and the Oregon defense just continues to impress. They continue to get better. This is one where technically Purdue was able to run the ball, but at the end of the day, they didn't need to run the ball. They needed to throw the ball, and they were not able to do that even a little bit. Under 100 yards passing, and that was the difference because they were down 21-0 in a hurry. But at the end of the day, remarkable response from Oregon, one of those that has to build a ton of confidence in what this team can be, and frankly confirms to me that they are very much a title contender moving forward. Then we got to talk about Iowa State. What a finish to this game. It was a game that they badly, badly needed to win, and they were able to keep their undefeated season alive with 1:18 on the clock. A remarkable drive from Rocco Becht and the Cyclones to capped by a Rocco Becht rushing touchdown. Just avoid a disaster, which was very much on the horizon in this one, because the reality is Iowa State gave up 62 passing yards in this game. Feels like a way you win a game. Well, when you give up 354 on the ground, it's going to be an issue. So that's something that Iowa State needs to figure out, and frankly, that was a strength coming into this game. They were able to absolutely stonewall West Virginia last weekend, but UCF just had their number. RJ Harvey went for 196, 2 scores. Ja'Cory Brown, the backup quarterback that came in for KJ Jefferson last week, 154 and a pair of scores as well. They got to be able to figure that out if you're Iowa State, but at the end of the day, the Iowa State offense picked up the slack when they absolutely needed to. 274 through the air, 256 on the ground. Jalen Noel had 153 on the day. 3 rushers had over 50 yards. Really, really good stuff. A couple of picks kind of kept UCF in this game, but really awesome stuff from this Iowa State offense, and you did what you needed to do. You kept your undefeated season alive, and you keep moving forward in a conference where people are falling like flies, and we'll talk about that actually in the next segment here, but Clemson gets another dominating win, and this was one that looked a little bit nicer than it actually, the score looked a little bit nicer than it was. Virginia outscored Clemson 21-10 in the fourth quarter after being down 28. So made it look a little bit nicer, made it look a little bit cleaner. But at the end of the day, another great performance from the Clemson team. Garrett Riley's just rolling now. He feels fully confident in the guys that he has. He feels fully confident in Cade Klubnik, and he's playing around with a lot of stuff. Even Antonio Williams, as you can see, hit a deep ball in this game. So they had 345 through the air, 195 on the ground. It's just everything is going right for this Clemson offense right now, and they head into their bye 6-1. And frankly, if I told any Clemson fan that you were going to be 6-1 going into your bye and your only loss was to Georgia, they would sign up 10 times out of 10. That was probably what they expected going into this season. So now you feel really good. You got Louisville at Virginia Tech at Pitt coming out of the bye, so going to be really tough. And then obviously South Carolina at the end of the season will be a very interesting matchup. But 11-1 still very much on the table. Definitely some hurdles coming up that'll be a little bit bigger than the ones that they've jumped over thus far. Then we got a Notre Dame-Georgia Tech game that was just interesting. I watched pretty much all of this game, and Notre Dame was a team that I don't love. I'll be totally honest with you. I think the loss to Northern Illinois should have knocked them out of the CFP. I understand it doesn't, but they've been playing a little bit better football. This was not necessarily a super inspiring performance from the Fighting Irish. Now, the defense was absolutely dominant. They played really, really good football. Now, Georgia Tech only had 64 yards on the ground. That's exactly what Georgia Tech needs to do to win games. Notre Dame got 2 picks from Zach Pyron in this game, and they even blocked a field goal. So they really did their job. I'm not necessarily trying to tear down Notre Dame here, but it is one of those things where this is not necessarily the dominating performance that they probably wanted in this one, and they got a lot to figure out because Navy this upcoming weekend, another neutral site game over there in MetLife, and it's going to be fascinating to watch that one. Cannot wait for it. I think there's a lot of people that are cheering for Navy in that game. I won't necessarily give out my pick until later this week, but definitely a very, very interesting game that if Notre Dame's not careful and they play this level of game, I don't know if they're winning it, but we'll get into that one later on in the week. Another one that happened on that Friday night and was a little bit wild towards the end of this one. BYU does the exact same thing that Iowa State did, frankly, and comes back with about a minute left, 75 yards, 8-play drive, and snatch a win away from Oklahoma State, who played probably their best game of the year, at least offensively. Ollie Gordon got over 100 yards. They did what they needed to do. Well, offensively, they were incredible against Arkansas, so I won't necessarily say that, but they did have a quarterback change in this game. I believe Garrett Rangel just went down, and Alan Bowman came in. They both had a touchdown. They both had a pick. Pretty much the quarterback situation over there at Oklahoma State right about now, but BYU needed this one really bad, and it was very interesting because BYU, the first couple of weeks, a lot of their wins, you'll look back on them and say, they got a lot of bounces their way. They got that couple of picks, that pick six, the things that aren't necessarily super sustainable. They were getting pretty much week over week, which was very wild to watch. They didn't get it in this one. They lost the turnover battle, and they were able to win it. So that's a huge, huge confidence builder, and one of those that I didn't think BYU was necessarily capable of winning. So absolutely huge for them, and proves that they're a team that not only can win because things go their way, but they can win even when things don't go their way all that much. Then we had another team that was tested just a little bit on the road over there at Mississippi State. Texas A&M gets a big-time win, and I think it's one of those things, not the prettiest performance by any means, but you got LSU on the horizon. You have a Mississippi State team that's gaining confidence every single week. I'm not necessarily going to be super worried about this one. I am a little bit worried about Connor Wegman's play in this one. I believe he had 2 picks, so a lot to figure out there. No two ways about that. But at the end of the day, getting out there, getting a road win in the SEC, especially this year, is not necessarily an easy thing to do. But Michael Van Buren is someone I want to talk about, the quarterback for Mississippi State. He's a really good player, and I think he's going to be a problem next year when people have to prepare for him, because 22 for 41, 242, 3 touchdowns, 1 pick in this game. He does everything for this offense. He's really, really incredible, and he's had a start to his career that was at Texas, at Georgia, and then A&M at home. It's going to get easier. Maybe he just totally lights the world on fire the rest of the way. But A&M currently sits atop the SEC, and they got LSU coming to town, which will decide what goes forward in the SEC as the top team. But as of right now, I think the biggest thing is Connor Wegman's got to clean it up a little bit. Can't have 2 picks in that game against LSU and expect to win. So a lot of things to figure out for A&M. But you get a win on the road at the SEC. I'm not necessarily going to scoff at that by any means. This was a weird game, yet another game that Auburn just finds a way to win, and I cannot for the life of me figure out how they did it, but they continue to do it. It's one of those things that I know Josh Payton, a lot of people around the industry talk about a lot. Winning games is a skill, and Auburn does not have it by any means. But both these teams played pretty ugly football. Missouri missed 2 field goals, had 2 fumbles. Auburn missed 1 field goal, had 1 fumble, and they won the turnover battle and still somehow lost. I genuinely cannot fathom how Auburn gets this done every single week, but Missouri needed this one badly. They fall in this one, and then they go on the road to Tuscaloosa kind of licking their wounds. Does not feel good. But now you go to Tuscaloosa with them licking their wounds and you feeling pretty confident, and you win that one. It's a program-defining win, the biggest win of Eli Drinkwitz's career, and definitely puts you on a very, very good track for the CFP and maybe even pencils you in. But we'll get there when we get there. SMU Stanford. This was one where I was really impressed by what SMU was able to do. I think it's one of those games that's very easy to kind of scoff at. You say SMU beat Stanford, move on to the next thing. And obviously, they should have beaten Stanford. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have, but Kevin Jennings, 17 for 27, 322, 3 touchdowns, only 1 INT in this game. Absolutely huge. And the SMU defense totally dominated. A little over 200 yards allowed, 2 INTs, less than 1 yard per carry. Remarkable stuff from that group. And overall, I think it's one of those things that you needed this win because now you have a weird travel schedule ahead. You got to go from the West Coast back home and then over to the East Coast to play Duke this upcoming weekend. So need that win, going to be really tough. And then you got Pitt back at home. So if you win all 3 or the next 2 of those games, this is very well a CFP team. But we can get there when we get there. Going to be a crazy finish for SMU this year. And then we got ECU Army. They continue to roll along. This team just may never trail again. They're absolutely remarkable. Bryson Daly, honestly deserves a little bit of Heisman love, but that's neither here nor there. He's playing really, really good football. 7 for 10, 147, 1 touchdown through the air, 31 carries, 171 yards, 5 touchdowns on the ground. And him and Kanye Uda are going to be an absolute problem for anyone that they face, including Notre Dame coming up in a couple of weeks here. And the other news coming out of this one is ECU has fired their head coach, Mike Houston, the first head coach firing of the year, and one that was pretty much the writing was on the wall. I think it was one more loss and it was pretty much it, and this just happened to be the one. But overall, one of those games that Army just continues to roll right along and definitely are a team to worry about when you get into the CFP. And then their counterpart, Navy, just went to work once again. It was absolutely insane what these teams are able to do every single week. But Blake Horvath, 7 for 13, 117, 3 touchdowns passing. Alex Tezca added 2 rushing touchdowns and a very cool backflip celebration. This defense went to work as well. Deshaun Peel, a very, very good corner for this team. Frankly, this Navy team has a couple of very good corners in Deshaun Peel and Rayon Lane that are guys to watch, and they both had picks in this game, but Deshaun Peel just happened to take 2 picks back for touchdowns. Just remarkable stuff from that guy on that day, and Navy team is a load to deal with. They have so many different ways they can attack you offensively, and if they beat Notre Dame, they are very well your CFP Cinderella moving forward. Going to be really, really fun to watch this team the rest of the way, and this weekend is the one. No two ways about that. But let's take our final break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about just everything else. There's so many other games that we're going to have to get to, and probably we'll end up going into tomorrow just a little bit, but at the end of the day, I have a couple of games, including one that Vandy might have been looking ahead just a little bit to Texas, but we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about those top 25 results all around the country. A couple of teams that struggled, including Missouri and A&M, but kept their dreams alive. No two ways about that. And in a 12-team playoff, it's just about getting wins and moving forward at the end of the day. And before we jump into the fifth segment, just want to thank everyone that's watching. Always love to see a couple of people in the chat here, and definitely a very, very fun way for me to go about my day. Whenever I get to see a couple more people pop into that chat, kind of just makes me feel good. Just wanted to give a little appreciation to everyone that's watching live, as well as everyone that watches afterwards. It means the world to me, and I cannot express that enough. And I'll try to as many times as I possibly can throughout the rest of this year. But let's get into this Vanderbilt game. Weird one. One that, at face value, you see that score and you say, man, Vanderbilt played terrible football. They were all over the place. They did not play very well. They let a team get on them. And frankly, they probably did get a little bit look-ahead point towards Texas, and maybe they can just get that win this upcoming weekend. We'll talk about that one later in the week. Going to be a very interesting one to break down. But at the end of the day, Diego Pavia was the whole offense for Vandy in this one. 17 for 31, 275, 1 touchdown passing, 13 carries, 81 yards, 1 touchdown rushing. And the legend just continues to grow. He's one of my favorite players in the country, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. But this one would be easy to stress about if you're a Vanderbilt fan, or really if you're someone that just wants to watch this Vanderbilt run continue. But at the end of the day, Vanderbilt only had 9 possessions in this game. They scored on 5 of them. And you obviously have to turn more of those 3s into 7s. No two ways about that. But if you're really taking just anything away from this one, it's Ball State kind of just executed the game plan. Vanderbilt got the win despite of that. So I think it's one of those wins that's easy to get worried about. I wouldn't be overly worried if I was a Vanderbilt fan just overall. And then this one, man, this one was over very quickly. It was OU INT on the very first play, Oklahoma INT on the very first play of the game. South Carolina scored in 5 plays. South Carolina scoop and score, South Carolina pick 6. That is how this game opened, and it was over. Frankly, I flipped to another game because I said in my head, there was no way Oklahoma scoring 21 points in this game, and I was absolutely right. And frankly, I don't know if they're scoring 21 points the rest of the way, guys. They got Ole Miss. They got a number of teams that are going to just be terrorizing on that defensive line, and they did let go of their offensive coordinator, Seth Littrell, which was one of the big-time things coming out of this one that likely needed to happen. There are a couple of scheme issues with that team and a couple of things where you have tight ends blocking Kyle Kennard, which is insanity, but at the end of the day, probably a move that needed to happen. But with this offensive line, wide receiver, and quarterback situation, you'd be hard-pressed to find a play caller that can make that work. But at the end of the day, probably a move that needed to happen. South Carolina just continues to be one of the most dangerous teams in the SEC. They had 9 sacks in this game and 13 tackles for loss. They were all over the place and absolute issues for Oklahoma to deal with, and they're going to be issues for everyone to deal with, all the way down to Clemson at the end of the year. They're one of those teams that can run the table. They can lose a number of games, but they're really, really fun to watch, and I think this is just a precursor to the real year in 2025. But at the end of the day, we'll talk about that down the road. But moving on to this one, how do they keep losing these games? How does USC continuously lose these games? They're up by 14 points at halftime. They had scored on 4 of the final 5 drives in the first half. And then in the second half, they have an INT, missed field goal, and a turnover on downs, and they let Billy Edwards come all the way back for Maryland. It's absolutely insane what this USC team does at the end of games. And I think a lot of it is a Lincoln Riley problem. A lot of it's just a personnel issue. A lot of it is just a lot of things. And frankly, I know the leash is going to be very, very tight when he heads into 2025. I don't think he's getting fired. I think a lot of people are being a little bit wishful there. And overall, I think he made the right defensive hire. I do think D'Anton Lynn's going to make an effect on this team. Now, you got to be able to recruit to make that effect really be realized. But at the end of the day, I do think they're going to be better in 2025, but I can promise you, they lose a couple of these Big Ten games the way that they've lost these, there's no way he's in town for very long. So definitely a lot of questions around that USC program right now, and it's one of those games that you look up at the end of it, and somehow USC comes out on the wrong side yet again. And I look forward. I don't know if there's a game that you feel overly confident in going forward other than the UCLA one at the end of the year, and they got a big win this past weekend. So a crazy, crazy year for USC, and one that probably should have stayed in the Pac-12 if this was going to be the product. But I'll leave it at that for the time being, and I'll move forward to a team that I just cannot get enough of right now. This Colorado team is so, so impressive. I didn't even pick them to win this game, and they came out, they just continue to prove me wrong, and I kind of love it. This team is so much fun to watch. They have so many playmakers all over the field. One of the best quarterbacks in the entire country in Shedeur Sanders, and he didn't even play great football. Or he played good football. I don't want to take anything away from him, but he did have 2 INTs in this game. They just won the game with defense. One of those things that I did not think they were going to be capable of doing. And Travis Hunter got hurt again in this game, only played 54 snaps all in the first half, so definitely something to watch going forward. But this Colorado team continues to answer the bell. There's no one on that schedule coming forward that they cannot beat. They got to go to Texas Tech. They got to play Utah. They got to play Oklahoma State. So there's definitely some issues that can be caused. No two ways about that. And I'm still wary of this team at the very least. But, man, they're playing really, really good football. And right now, if you're taking your Coach of the Year pick, if you're not putting Deion Sanders or Curt Cignetti in there, I don't know who you're picking, frankly. But moving forward to Baylor, Texas Tech is a missed moment for Texas Tech. They win this one, and they are in a very, very good spot in the Big 12, but now it feels like the season's kind of gone. And I don't want to say that. They only have 1 loss in this conference. They're playing fine football, and they absolutely can bounce back, especially with the craziness in this conference. But they got to go to Iowa State. They got to play Colorado. There's plenty of fights left for this team, and I think they missed a huge opportunity here. For Baylor, they went to work. They had 274 passing, 255 rushing, 5 scores on the ground, 3 through the air, or 3 on the ground, 5 through the air. Remarkable stuff. And it was one of those things that if Texas Tech can't stop Baylor offensively, it might be a long end of the year for them defensively. But overall, one of those things that Texas Tech had a grand moment to possibly take a little bit more control of this conference, and they left it on the table, and the Big 12 struck again, really more than anything else. Moving on to this game, because we got to talk about Aiden Childs. I think every single Michigan State fan around the globe was giddy in that second half, because that was the Aiden Childs that you have. He is somewhere in there. You just got to get it more consistently. He was making elite throw after elite throw, led scoring drives on every single drive in the second half. He was really incredible. In fact, I believe there was only one second half drive that didn't end in points, and it was Iowa throwing a pick. So very, very interesting stuff in the second half of this game, but a really bad loss for Iowa. No two ways about that. It's one of those that obviously I didn't think they were going to make a Big Ten title race, but this officially takes them out of it. Definitely still could go 9-3, 8-4, but a missed opportunity here that could get you spiraling just a little bit. It's one of those teams that felt like their offense was coming along last week, kind of reverts back to normal this week. So a very hard team to get a beat on. I still think they're moving in the right direction long term there, but definitely a missed opportunity to at least keep yourself in the fight. And then for Michigan State, you got a stretch of at Michigan, Indiana, at Illinois coming up, so you badly needed this win, especially if you wanted to get bowl eligible, so a huge win for them. If they beat Michigan next week, then it's going to be gangbusters for this team going forward. Everyone's going to be loving Michigan State going into 2025, I can promise you that. But I got to talk about this Florida team. They just are winning games. They're 3-1 in their last 4, the only loss coming in the overtime game at Tennessee, and this is a team that just continues to answer the bell in a game where didn't have Graham Mertz, didn't have Montrell Johnson. Jaden Baugh, did plenty in this game. 22 carries, 106 yards, 5 touchdowns on the ground. This guy is someone to watch going forward, a freshman running back that, if you're a Florida fan, you've known about this guy for quite some time. If you're a normal fan, kind of like myself, that's just following this stuff as much as he possibly can, this one came a little bit out of left field. I knew about Jaden Baugh, don't get me wrong, but I didn't know he had this in him. He was absolutely remarkable in this one, and the rest of the season for Florida is very interesting. You have very, very tough games coming forward that I don't necessarily expect you to win by any means, but they're starting to coach some pretty good football over there. I don't know. It's one of those situations, especially with all of the talent, the young talent you have on that team with DJ Lagway and Eugene Wilson and Jaden Baugh and all of these guys, and LJ McCray on the defensive side. I don't know. It's going to be a very, very interesting decision. I don't think Billy Napier is keeping his job, especially with the way that I tend to believe the end of the season is going to go for Florida. But I don't know. It's one of those things where maybe they just turn it around and we come to the end of the year, they're 6-6 or 7-5, and Billy Napier's staying there for 2025. I wouldn't bet on that, but something to watch. And then for Kentucky, this one's got to feel like deja vu just a little bit. It's another year, super talented roster, really good defense, a transfer quarterback coming in that you just need to execute, and you missed the mark. And frankly, they are staring down the barrel of a 5-7 season now. So they got a lot to figure out over there just as a program overall, but this year is pretty much a wash, and one that it really felt like Kentucky had something, especially after that Georgia game. And then this one. I wanted to touch on this one just for a second here. First of all, look how far the Big 12's come. All the way from that Patrick Mahomes, Baker Mayfield shootout that was absolutely ridiculous to a defensive-led Big Ten-esque game over there in Utah this past weekend. But this one was ugly for the vast majority of it. But the biggest story coming out of this one, more than anything else, is Andy Ludwig, the offensive coordinator for Utah, has stepped down from his position, obviously hoping it's nothing medical or family-related, hoping everything is all right off the field. There were some people that thought it was more of a mutual parting of ways. I'd be pretty surprised if that happened to Andy Ludwig mid-season, but what do I know? Maybe there's more information out there. But now, another challenge for Utah to face. A backup quarterback and now a new play caller. Not necessarily ideal by any means, but this is another year that just got away from Utah. Cam Rising gets injured and everything kind of falls apart. That's been the story for the past 4 years, really, for Utah, and it was again for this one. So you hate to see it for that kid, you hate to see it for this team, but TCU, on the other hand, huge win to put them in a place where they can absolutely make a bowl game this year, and although that's probably not what they wanted coming into this year, I think they'll take that right about now. So a huge win there, and one of those that I think you see just what Utah is without Cam Rising. It's a very, very different team. But overall, an incredible weekend, one of those that Plenty of controversy, plenty of big-time wins, plenty of close wins and blowout wins. Georgia planting their flag in the SEC. Texas with a lot of questions to answer. A million things. And I promise you we will continue to get into it tomorrow. We'll get into the things that we've learned this year. We'll get into winners, losers, a little bit of a whip around to all the other games we haven't had a chance to get to. So plenty coming for you guys tomorrow. And then we got to get into week 9, which is absolutely incredible as well. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. Have really incredible people doing awesome work across every single sport you could want. We'll get you ready for the World Series over here. We'll get you ready for the NBA season coming up. A million different things happening in sports, and everything is covered over here at GSMC. So definitely come on over and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will be back tomorrow to probably talk a little bit more about officiating in college football.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.